Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on getting started with prompt engineering. So today we're going to take you through getting the most out of Copilot, which using robust prompts to achieve your desired outputs. This is just for reference, this is the first in a series of webinars that we're doing. The next one is how leadership can drive ROI for Copilot. After that, extensibility for Copilot, and eventually Microsoft Copilot's which tool when, as there's quite a lot of Copilots out there. You can scan the QR codes on the screen to register for those upcoming events. If you've got any questions today during this webinar, you can drop them into the chat. We'll leave some time at the end of this to answer any of those questions. So, just before we take a look at the agenda, I'm James Mace. I'm a senior consultant at WM Reply, and I'm going to be taking us through prompt engineering, the basics, getting started with Copilot M365. Okay, so agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We're going to spend most of the second half of the webinar looking at examples. We're going to do a little bit of an intro of the background in prompt engineering and how it's become so important. And dive into what it is, and also take a look at what it's not. The goal of today's webinar is really to give you a good understanding of prompt engineering. Now, prompt engineering is a whole discipline. There are courses on prompt engineering. It's a whole field of study, but we're going to try to get you a really good understanding of prompt engineering in a short amount of time, mostly so that you can get better results, so that you can improve your natural language when talking with an AI. We're going to touch on that quite a bit. Try to reduce errors and bias, and also reduce the need for manual efforts, and really bump up your prompt game so that you get the best results, right? Spending a bit more time crafting your prompts, meaning better outcome. Couple little housekeeping things. I mentioned the questions already. I will mention a few links, a few articles. If I mention those throughout the talk, they will be provided in an email sent afterwards, along with the recording of the session for those who have registered today. And most of the time, mostly I'll be talking about Copilot, specifically Copilot for M365. However, all of the information in today's session should apply for any of the Copilots, as well as any of the broader AI tools out there, such as ChatGPT and Gemini. Okay. All right, so let's dive in with a little bit of background. Okay, so what I want to try to do today is kind of give you a sense of why prompt engineering is kind of important. So I want to sort of set the stage a little bit here. And really, I want to take us all the way back to humans evolving language, right? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we start talking to each other. Today, that is still the most natural way to communicate. And you'll see as we progress over time, we develop writing, right? Great marvel for human advancement, but we move away a little bit from talking and body language and context cues and all that kind of stuff that you get from talking to someone. Jumping forward a little bit, skipping over the printing press, we get to typewriting, again, using a device to interface or to write a message, and eventually that evolving into the keyboard. We're getting less and less kind of natural interaction. We need some way to interact with these machines, but the road we've been going down is things like keyboards. And eventually, in the last 70 years, we get things like joysticks and pens and haptic feedbacks and mouse and all these kinds of elements, taking us further away from natural language. Now, I'm going to jump a little bit into the future. Perhaps in the future one day, whether it's a utopia or dystopia is up to you, but if you pick your favorite sci-fi movie and think of how people are generally interacting with robots or computers or AI in the future, we could call that sort of true artificial intelligence, and it could be indistinguishable from a human, meaning it has things like memory and nuance and body cues and body language, and can read our body language, and you wouldn't really need prompt engineering at that point. You would just be having a conversation with another person, or indistinguishable from another person. So where are we now? I feel like we're at basically the early stage on our route to whatever that future might look like. And we are sitting in an era where prompt engineering only in the last sort of couple of years has really come to the stage, and we're in that early stage. Is it a fully natural conversation? Not quite. We're not something that's quite sort of human intelligence. And And we're largely talking to AI that's referred to as generative AI. So Copilot, Midjourney, ChatGPT, all those tools are generating content. So they're not that sort of true human experience or indistinguishable from the human experience. We're talking about generative AI tools. And this is important, as you'll see as we kind of go through this, right? So prompt engineering kind of came really popular in the last couple of years. In fact, if you looked at the Google trend as to when people started searching for it, it's December 2022, which is pretty recent, incidentally, around the same time as ChatGPT started showing up in the Google trends. There's some evidence that it's maybe been used over the past 10 years for basic things like search queries and SQL queries and stuff like that, but it's really come about largely because of a huge number of advancements in technologies that have allowed us to use this natural language to interface with these tools. And these tools are largely based on large language models and a bunch of supporting technologies. Now, this isn't a technical deep dive on this webinar. We're going to be showing a bunch of examples on how to use this kind of stuff. I am going to spend a little tiny bit of time explaining how they kind of work, just so you get a better, deeper understanding of how you create your prompts and why that kind of matters, right? Also, fun fact, I didn't find anyone that was attributed with coming up with prompt engineering as a phrase. It seems to have sort of evolved in the natural language. So why is this important? I mentioned this already. It's basically the most natural way to interact with an AI system. It's not quite fully speaking to another person and having body language and all that kind of stuff. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. We'll come back to that. But there are some people out there that think it's a fad, or that it will go away, or that prompting is not much different from putting something into a search engine and getting some results back. Personally, I don't think it's going to go away. You're going to see as we go through this presentation that there is quite a lot of depth to prompt engineering, quite a lot more that we can cover in this webinar. And I believe it'll basically evolve as those technologies improve, as new technologies come along, and as we approach whatever our future looks like. We will adapt prompt engineering. It might get more and more natural. Maybe there'll be ways to, read context and have memory and body language and all that kind of stuff, and it'll be an evolutionary track, but it's certainly here to stay. Okay, so what is it? Let's dive into what prompt engineering is. Just spend a bit of time talking about this, and then we'll get to some examples. So if we look at the two words, prompt and engineering, prompt is pretty straightforward, right? That's usually referred to as the text, but could also mean image, video, audio, that you're inputting into the system, right? Into the AI tool. Engineering, now that's the part where it really kind of takes it up a notch, right? So we're talking about, a methodical, systematic approach, right? Engineering is generally the application of scientific, mathematical, practical knowledge to do a variety of different things: design, build, maintain, research, etc. So when we talk about prompt engineering, you move past sort of simple search or simple creation and really move into another realm. And that's what we're going to talk about today. If we ask the tools what they think prompt engineering is, we get very similar results, right? So I asked to find what prompt engineering is in one sentence, assuming I know nothing about prompt engineering, and you get 3 different results from Copilot, ChatGPT, and Gemini that are all very similar. They all talk about designing or creating prompts, or refining input, or clear instructions, right? So some sort of input into the system. And then what the purpose is to elicit a specific response, or produce a desired output, or help it understand what you want it to do. I thought it was interesting that Gemini paid the closest attention to my prompt, since I put the same prompt into each of the 3 systems and got 3 different results. I said to assume I know nothing about prompt engineering, and it provided a very basic explanation. Also, for fun, I switched my prompt up and I asked it, help me explain prompt engineering to someone, and said, don't do it in one sentence, just provide as much detail as possible. And it produced like 6 paragraphs of information. So it really matters what that prompt is. And we're not going to talk about it right now, but we're going to show some examples coming up. I could have just said, define what prompt engineering is, and left it at that. I could have just went to Google and searched and found a definition on Wikipedia or dictionary. But I added some additional elements, right? In one sentence, assuming I know nothing about prompt engineering. These are actual elements of prompt engineering, and we're going to explain those coming up. Just before we do that, Let's take a quick look at what it's not. And the next slide is going to show how this thing works, or how these large language models work. Again, not too much of a technical deep dive. We're just going to barely skim the surface. But I want you to keep this in mind when you're crafting your prompts. And I feel like this is an important distinction so that you don't fall into the habit of thinking that these things are human, because they're not. And so they don't have various human attributes, which we'll see as well. So is it a person? No, no one's sitting there typing away, responding to you. It's not pre-canned response like a lot of bots used to be, team bots or bots in the past. People had to write out what you thought the question might be and what the response might be. And if you asked a question that it didn't know how to respond. So it's not anything like that. Is it thinking? For people sort of look at ChatGPT spitting out each of the words as it goes through and then pause for a second, spit out more words and kind of be like, oh, it's thinking. Well, no, that's a very human attribute that we're applying to these things, and they're very much not thinking. Is it speaking a language? So weirdly, no, it has no concept of what language is. I can explain a little bit about what it actually is doing, but it's certainly not understanding a language such that we understand language, verbs and nouns and sentence structure and all that kind of stuff. Is it constructing actual sentences? No, it's not actually doing that either, right? Next up, search engines. Bit of a trick question. A pure large language model, the core engine behind these AI tools, isn't a search engine out of itself. It's not indexing a bunch of terms and looking them up, although you can connect these systems to search engines to enhance them. And that's actually a pretty good example of Copilot. Copilot is connected to your M365 data. We're not going to really do a deep dive into how that all sort of works, but it has access to what you have access to and maintaining sensitivity and security and all that kind of great stuff. And so it has sort of the best of both worlds, if you will. And lastly, it's not a database, at least not in the traditional sense of tables, rows, columns, retrieve this information from the database where this equals this, SQL queries, all that kind of stuff. It's not that either, right? So what is it? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Like I said, this is a technical deep dive, but I want to briefly explain what it's actually doing behind the scenes, just to give you a real sense of how just not human these things are, right? So if you ask it a basic prompt, what is the capital of France? How does it know what it's talking about? How do you know that you mean capital city, not capital funds, capital punishment, capital letter, right? So it's not looking up the definition of these words, it's not searching in a search engine, it's not looking it up in a database, as we just talked about. So how does it even know what you're talking about? Well, there's some magic that happens in these large language models that isn't actually magic, of course, but it seems to be magical when you experience these tools, because if you ask, what is the capital of France? It takes those words and breaks them into tokens, breaks those down into numbers, and then there's a whole bunch of transformation, association, and vector relationships between these things, and all this sort of technical babble about how these things work. The gist of this is really to understand that these things don't communicate like a human. They convert words to numbers, crunch all the numbers, derivative calculus, yay, maths, coming back to haunt us. Never thought we'd have to use that again. And then converting all those back into numbers. So okay, so we don't have to worry about actually worrying about what the math is doing. And it's literally taking whatever you write into the system and spitting back the first word, and then the second word, and then the third word, and then the fourth word. And it's building up those things bit by bit by bit as it goes through. Everything you type in, everything it responds with, it spits that back in. The next prompt that you do is just continuously over and over and over feeding this information back in, crunching everything with numbers, right? Why is that important? Well, it's because we really got to sort of pay attention to this in our prompting. The sole input is your prompt. That's not quite true. There's maybe some hidden system prompts. There's maybe some additional information coming from M365, for example. But generally, what you write in is the only thing it has to work with. It doesn't have common sense. It doesn't have body language. It doesn't have any inherent skills. It can't read your mind, right? It can't do some of that inference that humans. If you ask a human what is the capital of France, they probably know you mean capital city of France and not sort of, capital punishment or some other thing, because when you say France, France is a country and countries have capital cities. Well, the large language model is probably doing that same kind of inference, doing all those number crunches and connecting all those dots to sort of figure out the same thing. But that's why it can sometimes get it wrong. If you've ever heard the term hallucinating, That's kind of where that comes from. Now, I'm not a fan of that word. Microsoft doesn't really use it. OpenAI doesn't really use it. I think we need to sort of let that word kind of die. It generally sort of meant that like, oh, and AI made something up or got something wrong and it was hallucinating. Well, if you really know what's going on with those words, tokens, numbers, and generating each word, and it's basically just playing probabilities, that's why the response is always a bit different. It's always making stuff up, always. It just happens to get the right response a lot of the time, but that depends on your prompt, right? So all about how important prompt engineering is. If you're curious, by the way, there is a visual guide that explains some of those tokens and numbers and how a large language model works from The Guardian. As I mentioned, any links that I reference will be in a follow-up email after this, but it means it's very important what is in your prompt. So final word on prompt engineering. It's kind of both about the conversation that you have. So prompt, response, and expecting to sort of plan for a conversation a lot of the time, and the individual prompt itself, although there isn't really such thing as a perfect prompt. We generally want to apply some engineering to both the conversation, different techniques that we'll see in a minute, and different techniques to the prompt itself to really get the most out of these systems. So without further ado, let's dive in to how do we use prompt engineering. Okay, so like I said, the bulk of today is going to focus on examples in Copilot, but I do have a few other bits and pieces that I'm going to show that generally work in Copilot. All of this works kind of across all of the AI tools, but just want to take a moment and give you a real sense of just how deep prompt engineering goes. Okay, which is why there's whole courses to it. There's job roles allocated to it. It's certainly not, sort of a quick fad that's going to disappear. But this is just a partial compilation that I put together myself from various different courses I've taken or reference articles that are out there on the web, asking the tools themselves of types of prompts or techniques that are relating to prompt engineering. Huge. We don't have time to cover all this today. Don't worry. We're gonna pay attention to a couple of them. There are a couple of favorites that I'm going to highlight and explain, and we're going to show some very specific examples of how we can use some of this stuff in Copilot, a little bit beyond just the basic sort of create and search content. So just while we're on this slide, just before we jump into the Copilot examples, I want to point out a couple of my favorites on here, fun things that you can do with an AI tool such as Copilot or ChatGPT before you even sometimes necessarily write a prompt or change how you write that prompt. One of the fun ones I like is question refinement. Okay, this is an interesting one where basically you give the AI tool an instruction. You say, every time I ask a question, propose a better version of this question and ask if I want to use that. Okay, so if our whole game is making better prompts and I write a prompt and the system's actually suggesting a better one, then I'm already ahead of that game and it's already suggesting a more detailed or better prompt. And if I say, yes, it looks good, I want to use it, it'll use that to generate the response. Better prompt, better response. And I'm getting the system to help me with my prompting. Great, awesome. Couple other quick ones on here. Flipped interaction is kind of a neat one. If you're trying to accomplish a certain goal, you could write a prompt to say that this is what you want to do, but then tell the AI tool to ask you questions instead of you always having to ask and prompt for information. And so it flips and starts asking you for details about this and details about this and what do you think of this and all this kind of stuff to solve whatever you're trying to solve. So some really neat tools in here that you can use. I suggest basically going to Google and go to the tools themselves and ask how to do these. There's courses, Coursera, LinkedIn. Again, this is a massive discipline to look into, and we're going to barely sort of scratch the surface today, but let's dive into it. So take a slight step back here and start kind of at the beginning. So Copilot, right? We're talking mostly about Copilot for M365. Shows up in the app in your Teams or as a chat. And when you go there, you get some examples, kind of similar when you go to ChatGPT, you get some examples on the screen. So these ones are very much more business focused, and you can see you get sort of, create an FAQ, list some ideas, write an email. And if you click view prompts, you can takes you over to Copilot Lab, where there's a whole bunch more of these examples, and you can kind of sort and filter them. You can save prompts, but largely you'll get the sense that they're kind of similar, right? Create a document, write an email, suggest this, break this down, summarize this, that sort of thing. So they're largely falling into these categories, okay, for Copilot. Learning about something, maybe asking about what a project is or explaining a concept, editing text, maybe checking for inconsistencies, transforming documents, right? Take this Word document, make a PowerPoint presentation out of it. Summarize is a hugely popular one, right? Write an abstract, executive summary, that sort of thing, 5 bullet points. Create from scratch new content, and catch up on missed items, also a really handy one as well, like reviewing what you missed in a meeting, for example. Now, are any of these prompt engineering? No. Will they save you time? Absolutely. Are they great to know how to do? Absolutely. Go to Copilot, look at all the examples in there. You'll save yourself a bunch of time summarizing stuff, writing stuff, creating all that good stuff. But they barely, well, they don't even really count as prompt engineering. They're just sort of basic prompts. So let's look at how we can apply prompt engineering to these and up our prompt game. Okay, if you search for Copilot out on the web and Microsoft, and maybe seen some of the presentations Microsoft has done and some of the announcements around Copilot and that sort of thing, you'll see a slide similar to this. And this is almost like Microsoft's version of prompt engineering a prompt. It says perfect prompt at the top. Not really such a thing, but we're trying to get as close as we can. It's better than just generate a summary. But this still only just scratches the surface. But we can see a few things in here, right? We've got a goal on what we want it to accomplish. We've got context, who's involved, why do we need it, source, which information we're using, expectations, but there's more that we can do. And more importantly, the tools are more powerful than just getting it to generate some bullet points or a summary, all right? So let's dive into an expanded version of this. So backing up to our basic prompt, summarize this Word document, probably going to be a bit too broad. You're probably going to have to go and edit it, not really going to save you any time. So we do an expert prompt like we just saw, right? Summarize this section. Okay, there's our goal. Timelines in this Word document. There's our source. We need an overview for my team for tomorrow's planning meeting. There's our context. Keep the summary to 5 points. Use simple language. That's kind of our expectation. Great. Is that enough? Is that it? No. Okay, so that's some basic engineering applied to that particular prompt, but we really should be going past that, and we really can with these tools. So if we think of this as trying to plan out to have a conversation, okay, so starting with that summarized idea, but this time let's modify it a little bit and include an audience. And we're going to come back to this in another slide. This is one of my favorite prompting examples, but we're going to sneak in the term project managers in there since we're talking about timelines and planning, just as an example, but it could be whatever role is applicable to that information. And that role is interesting because if you think about what this is doing, taking all that text, number crunching, generating the content, now I've added some additional context in there that's going to relate to all the rest of this text that I've put in there and produce text and results that is maybe more applicable or more in the language for those project managers, right? So I'm trying to get even more value out of this. But even just this prompt is still pretty basic. Yes, I'm going to rock up to that meeting tomorrow and have 5 key points that I can summary points that I can begin the meeting with and talk about with the team. But you can do so much more. One example of this is to follow up in that conversation after you've got your summary and say, what questions should the project managers ask of that section or that document, and include those answers to the questions. Okay, boom, this is a whole other world. This isn't just taking some content and producing a 5-point, bullet summary to prepare for a meeting and maybe saving you some time. This is getting this tool to think. It's not human, but it's acting almost like sort of another colleague or another thing that can analyze all this information and try to predict questions that you would ask of this information. This is super powerful and goes beyond just sort of simple time saving and really adds sort of business value. I've got real world example of this where I've been sitting in a meeting, brainstorming ideas around the table, and as much as you're sitting around a table full of your smart colleagues and everyone is good at their job, there's a limited number of people, limited resources. You're not necessarily going to come up with every idea. But if you tell Copilot to do it, it can sit there and generate, maybe like 10 ideas. And maybe in my example, we were talking about a bunch of ideas, brainstorming ideas. We covered off about 80% of those. And there were a few more that no one had come up with, but Copilot had. And you spit those ideas out to the group and you go, okay, well, that one's not so valid, but that idea, ooh, love that idea. Let's incorporate that into our document or our plan or that sort of thing. Super, super powerful, right? And a lot more deeper than just getting a summary, just scratching that surface, right? So you want to iterate, you want to have that conversation. You can even continue this conversation. I ran out of room on this slide, but you could then say, what's missing from the document, or what would you suggest to improve the timeline, right? Again, getting it to really kind of get in there and do some interesting insight into the data, because it can analyze all that text and spit back all this information. So why not have it actually, do something really cool? Maybe analyze it for inconsistencies. Maybe the timeline reference somewhere else in the document is out of whack and that sort of thing, right? So you really dig deeper, right? Next up, we're going to look at meetings in a similar kind of vein of a meeting. A little bit different, but there's some interesting things that happen with meetings as well. Okay, so excuse me. So if we just started with summarize this meeting, pretty basic, probably a bit too broad, won't give us what we want. So let's take the example we did in the previous slide. We engineer that a little bit and we say, okay, summarize this meeting, provide me my key takeaways and action items for everyone and who they're assigned to, put that in a table, something like that, something a bit more beefier, right? To get that first initial kind of summary from the meeting. Okay, well, why stop there, right? There's so much more that these tools can do. And again, it's sort of like getting another colleague or another person to help think of this, but it's not. They're not humans. It's not how it sort of works. People do say, you can treat AI kind of like your grad student coming in and doing some work and stuff like that, but they don't have context, right? AI tools don't have that context. They don't have everything else that a person kind of does. They don't have common sense. So you really got to prompt it and write those specific prompts to get it to do what you want. So to expand on just a summary, you could ask what the next steps could be from that meeting. Okay, so this is really interesting because everybody in that meeting probably talked about a variety of actions and stuff that they need to do, and you can summarize those actions, great, but what about other actions? What about maybe Copilot might sort of look at the conversation and say, well, you need to do a follow-up workshop with this and send an email for this and create other actions that nobody else had actually mentioned in the meeting, right? Really powerful business value if you dig a little deeper with these tools. Could also ask you something like what additional questions could be asked that weren't, right? That's also quite powerful. Some of these happen sort of after the meeting, during the meeting, right? During the meeting, a few good examples are someone says something, you don't quite understand it, and rather than sort of interrupt their flow in the meeting, you can actually bring up Copilot and say, can you rephrase what so-and-so just said? Get the Copilot to kind of explain it a different way and maybe get some better understanding on what's being discussed. Another thing is maybe you're struggling to contribute to a meeting, and so you can say, what is a good question to ask? And then ask that question in the meeting and that sort of thing. One of the key things about having meetings, again, if you're recording them and turning on the transcription, of course, so you can use them with Copilot, is it means they're no longer these one-time events, right? Like how often have you written down some notes on your notepad, can't read your writing? Okay, you switch to OneNote or Loop, you write stuff down, but then someone else in your team wrote stuff down and then your notes kind of conflict because you kind of not quite sure what you understood. You try to go back to the meeting, oh, we didn't have the recording, or even if you do, it's an hour long, you got to watch it. Takes a lot of time, right? So all these tools can help speed that all up. And it basically, Microsoft kind of refers to these meetings now as digital artifacts. And it means that they stick around and you can query them, ask them questions, can even dig into stuff like, did we talk about a certain subject? So a little while later, can't remember if we talked about something, go back to the meeting, ask if this was talked about. Did you talk about a client, a project, whatever? You can even get some personal insights either during or after the meeting. You can say, you know, who talked during the meeting or who didn't talk during the meeting, who didn't contribute, or did one person talk and no one else had a chance to say anything, right? Personal thing I like to do too is, did I ask Copilot if I cut anybody off? I have a really bad habit of cutting people off in meetings personally. And so I could ask Copilot, did I cut anybody off? And then ask that person to complete their thought and apologize for being such a jerk. Okay, so those are some pretty in-depth examples as far as we have time for sort of interacting with Copilot in meetings, generally in Teams, in the chat interface. We're going to look at a few other examples as we go along here that are maybe a little bit broader, can also apply to Copilot, also apply to some other tools within AI. One of my favorites, and this has come up a couple of times, in the very beginning, we said divine prompt engineering and explain it as if I don't know anything about it. One of the other examples also, you know, explain in simple language. And this all revolves around sort of an idea of like role play, persona, audience personas, different terms depending on where you look and who's defining it. And it generally falls into one of these sort of three categories. Meta prompt, by the way, is actually a brand new one, so we'll get that in a second. But it generally means before you start prompting, before you start even writing your prompt, you start with by instructing Copilot or whatever tool you're using to act as a particular role, then write the rest of your prompt. Okay, so me personally, I've actually started doing this 9 times out of 10 when I sit down in the machine, right? If we're sitting down, if we're taking just a minute to kind of pause and think, what am I doing? What am I trying to get out of this? It might seem a bit daunting because you're like, is this actually speeding up my work? I now think about a 3-sentence prompt to write into this thing, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's worth the effort. But if you act as a certain role, then write the rest of the prompt, remember that information about that role and those words are getting put in with the rest of your words into the number cruncher that comes back with the data. And so the results that come back are likely to be a little bit different or a little bit more specific to that role. And oftentimes that can help quite a bit, right? I actually think of it as if I was going to ask another human to help me with whatever I'm trying to do with my prompts, right? Am I going to talk to someone who's really good at writing or really good at software development or really good at marketing or whatever it is? And so that's my role. So I say, act as that role. Awesome. On the end of your prompt, you might put in something like, explain this to me as, you know, someone who doesn't know anything about it, or simple language, or high school student, or whatever, kind of an audience kind of thing. And you can actually use these two together. So you get say, act as a role, write out your prompt, and then say, explain this to me as such and such. Most of the examples show dumbing things down a little bit, like simple language, that kind of thing. But you can actually take this the other way around. This is kind of fun to do sometimes too. You can say, like, I could have said, act as an expert prompt engineer, explain prompt engineering to me as if I'm an expert prompt engineer, and you get a whole different set of language out of the tool. That sort of, you know, instead of simplifying it down, uses more interesting and advanced language. So it's fun to play kind of both ways. A more recent example of role play that has come out is this meta prompt. So this is kind of a framework idea, which is basically, if you read kind of the prompt that's on the screen, this is kind of the first little bit. You need a little bit more after this, but you basically tell the tool that it's a meta expert. Clever expert with the ability to collaborate with multiple other experts, right? So then you follow up this prompt by saying, this is kind of what I want to do, to challenge whatever you're doing within your prompt. And you say, now summon the right expert and begin solving the problem. And so this is kind of like a way to sort of like bulk, you know, use multiple experts rather than just a simple like act as a single expert. So it's really cool. I've actually used this and gotten results that spit back as this expert, blah, 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 result, as this expert, blah, 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 and have like 10 different experts all sort of chime in and all get slightly different the results come back because of that additional role being mentioned. And keep in mind, every role that gets pumped in alters the text that comes back from a number cruncher. Okay. Chain of thought, we're going to touch on really briefly here because it's a huge thing. If you notice, there's a bunch of subcategories on that. It's massive. This is more for solving complex problems. And the simple version here is to write whatever prompt that you're writing, and somewhere likely at the end, write some of these examples in here. So let's work this through this step by step, for example. Show me your work. And this basically instructs the AI tool to kind of break down and do something in sort of a step-by-step manner. So if you're struggling getting a result for something, or the result is not quite factual, or it's come back and it's a bit odd, or it's just wrong, you can try this technique and break stuff down. This is useful for things like math problems, which weirdly, even though it's doing a lot of number crunching in the background, AI models aren't necessarily known for being able to figure out sort of simple math problems. But if you tell it to work through step by step, it's like showing your work back in math class. Another example, this is kind of a good, bad example. These two prompts look very similar. If you read kind of through them, you'll kind of be able to spot maybe a spelling mistake, or what was good, what didn't work, that sort of thing. So the first prompt, basically what I was doing was some research for this webinar. There was an article I knew I had read, couldn't remember who it was by. Turns out it was from the Decoder. And we're going to talk about that actually in a minute. But I wrote the first prompt very quickly, made some spelling mistakes. It didn't come back with what I wanted. And I thought about it for a minute, and I did that sort of iterative sort of think about my prompt. And rather than sort of continue the conversation, in this case, I actually just edited my prompt. And you'll notice what I did was change a couple things. Some of this is probably just spelling mistake, yo to to, right? Communication, communicating. Arguably speaking, the natural language processing and large language models can usually figure that stuff out. But the key point here, actually, that I think that made the second prompt work versus the first is, in the first one, I said, it's, right? Mention that it's important for your work. As humans, that's a bit lazy on our part, because we kind of infer, or we kind of maybe know what we're talking about, and we have that kind of context. But the AI tools don't, as previously mentioned, and I keep going on about, right? So changing that one line in there to mention the answer is important to your work. So we're talking about the answer that come out of AI tools, and that got me the result, got me the link, and we're going to talk about that link in a minute. Okay, so last couple slides here as we're going to wrap this up. So this couple tips and strategies. So one article from Microsoft, again, we'll provide a link to that. There's also an article from OpenAI on some strategies and tips on using how you do your prompts and how you work with AI tools such as Copilot and ChatGPT. A lot of this we've already talked about it to some degree, right? Start with the end in mind. We talked about sort of defining the goal, what you're trying to do, maybe define any parameters, might be like tell it a certain date range or what information you want it to look at, right? Keep in mind, this is mostly about using Copilot on the Microsoft side of things, right? Be polite. That's a very interesting one. We're going to talk about that in the next slide, so we'll come back to that. And the last two are really cool. Be curious and iterate, iterate, iterate. It's kind of less sort of scientific language, but it's really talking about going in and asking questions, writing those prompts, iterating through, editing a prompt, trying again, maybe trying the same prompt in two different tools. That can always be kind of fun because you get slightly different results coming back, and trying to use that engineering aspect in your prompting. Similarly, OpenAI has a similar set of instructions. They vary a little bit. They sort of seem a little more technical, maybe to some degree, but write clear instructions, pretty straightforward. Give the model time to think. Not a fan of sort of think in quotes, but they do actually specify that's what they put in their article. It makes it sound human. It's not, right? But what they're referring to there is sort of the chain of thought idea we looked at a minute ago, where it's like telling it to show its work and having the tool kind of go through and break tasks down and that sort of thing, right? Use external tools. Copilot's already connected to your graph data in M365. OpenAI isn't. This maybe have the enterprise version. And test changes systematically, right? So it's all about sort of trying to get a little bit of that engineering into your prompting. The tip on this, just before we move on to the last slide and before we get to some questions, ChatGPT maintains separate conversations. Gemini does this as well. Copilot wasn't doing this for a little while. And so if you had a conversation that was just running on with Copilot and then suddenly wanted to talk about something else, keep in mind, all your prompts and all your responses are all being fed back in continuously into this number cruncher. And so if you switch topics and started talking about something else, it's a very good chance it could confuse those two topics and kind of start linking some information that really probably shouldn't be linking, and maybe providing some weird results. So in Copilot, you can type new chat and it'll generate a new chat. There are limitations. ChatGPT has a certain like token limit as to just how much data it can continuously kind of cycle into the system. Copilot works on sort of 1 of 30 responses it starts with and kind of goes through. Copilot now has the ability to kind of recognize more individual chats within the menu, so that you can actually go back and reference specific chats. So you don't necessarily need the new chat all the time. But good to know. Okay. Summing up, and one last little bit to look at here. Should you be nice to AI? This is an interesting topic, a bit of a divided topic, actually. And there's a couple elements on this one slide that I want to address. First is politeness. Second is emotional phrases. So we'll come back to that one in a second. Politeness, Microsoft has an article. Again, we'll provide the link in the follow-up email that suggests you should be nice to AI. Well, what does that actually mean? If you think about it, if you're writing text in your prompt that is polite, or please and thank you, whatever that is, keep in mind that's all being put into the number cruncher and coming back with text. And if that text has that same then sort of niceties, if that's the result that you want, then that would make sense, right? Especially maybe you're writing an email, you're trying to have nice language in it, so you use nice language to kind of get nice language. Kind of what you put in is kind of what you get out, right? If you put in a bit of sass, you're likely to kind of get a bit of sass back from the AI tool. Now, I did find another article out there that actually suggests that you shouldn't be nice to AI, or you should at least just be more like specific, write this, do this, right, that sort of thing. In the future, if you could talk to your dishwasher, you don't necessarily want to have to sit there and say, please do the dishes. You just want to give it a command and have it go. But for generative AI purposes, I think erring on the side of being polite is probably a good strategy, certainly recommended by Microsoft. And it's a good practice, I guess. The second part of this is emotional phrases. So this was what I was referring to earlier when I was trying to do some research, and I found an article and I'd forgotten about it, but it's a study that was done, article written by the Decoder that references this. A little bit of clickbait. It's something like gaslighting your chatbot. Title. But if you read through, it's actually really interesting. This paper suggests, and they did some research on this, that if you use emotional phrases in your prompts, you get better results, 10 to 11% better results. Those phrases, or some examples on the screen there, are things like, this is very important for my career. So write out your whole prompt, right? Generate 3 to 5 bullet points, blah, 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 use this, do this, blah, blah, blah. Add this at the end and spit that into the AI tool and see what it gives you back. Or something like take pride in your work, give it your best. Generally speaking, people found that the results coming back are better in some way, however they qualified that. And if you think about it, it's more text. It's really about those prompts, additional text that relate to itself, relate to the other information, that go into the number cruncher and come back generating that content. And the more you put in, the better results you can put back. Not necessarily the more, sorry, but the better prompt that you can craft and the better techniques that you can use can get you better results. And so that's really where we're going to leave this. Be nice to AI, be nice to each other. The ultimate goal is hopefully you've understood a little bit about how you can use some prompt engineering techniques. Maybe you've got a bit of an itch to scratch to dig into prompt engineering. Go take a course, go do some Googling, go ask one of the tools, Copilot, to explain prompt engineering to you, give you some examples. Hopefully you realize it's a lot more than just creating content or searching for content. Some of the very, very basic functionality that Copilot to do, you can do a lot more with it. And ultimately, if you can make better prompts, spend a bit of time crafting your prompts, approaching it more from an engineering perspective, you should then get better results and reduce your workload, be faster, less bias, all that kind of great stuff, and drive more business value. You know, not just walk into a meeting with a summary, but also a list of questions or a whole bunch of other insight that you can be prepared with. On that note, let's take it over to any questions that have come up. Okay, so I'm just checking something here. And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Carly, are you with me? Able to, were any questions that came up?
We have a bunch of them that
We have
popped
a
through in the
bunch?
Q&A.
Ah, okay, in the Q&A, yep, sorry. Okay, are there any questions that caught your eye as I was chatting there, Carly, that you'd like to me to
Yeah, I think we
address?
can probably hit them all. So we have one from Nick who asks, I've noticed that Copilot gives different results when I ask it to summarize meeting actions each time I ask, right after each other. Why is this?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I did touch on this a little bit, but I can add a little bit more context to this. So when I was explaining that little bit about text into tokens into numbers, right, and doing all that crunching, technically, it comes back with an array, a bunch of possible responses for that next word, okay? And then it chooses one of those words, right? And it spits that out. Then when it does it again, take your prompt and that word, spits it into the number cruncher, comes back. Again, it comes back with an array of the most likely word that would fit in that sentence, and then chooses one of those words and puts it in there. So it's generally referred to as temperature. If you look at sort of the settings of some of these tools in the background, what you can think of that is sort of like creativity or that kind of aspect, randomness kind of too, right? And if you turn that up, you'll get more variety in your responses. If you turn those down, you get more strict or more of the same type of responses. Generally, people don't necessarily have the ability to do that themselves. You can't go into Copilot and change the temperature, that sort of thing, but the people who build the tools can kind of set that randomness, as you were. It's sort of generally considered one of the aspects of a lot of the tools. They're generally set to be kind of a little bit more creative or a little bit more random than saying being very strict. And you'll get typically kind of different wording and different responses. And if you think of what that's doing, it's taking all your text and spitting it in. If you put the same prompt in each time, every time there's a random set of stuff that comes back, chances are one of those random responses is going to change the word. And then, of course, when that gets pumped into the system, the next word will depend on that previous word. And this will also be random and build a whole different sentence structure. So it's all that sort of weird magic that happens in the large language model, all that number crunching.
Awesome. All right. So next up, we have a question from Adnan where he asks, shouldn't Copilot act as a meta expert by default? Why do we need to prompt it to be?
Yeah, good question. So in one of the slides, I mentioned that your prompt is kind of the sole input. Okay, so technically, yes, it has wider input than that because it can access your data sitting in your M365 tenant. And there's likely a system prompt. I didn't really cover this in the talk, but I might have mentioned it briefly. But in behind the scenes, Microsoft, OpenAI, Google, there's probably a hidden prompt that says, be a nice assistant and respond in a professional, friendly manner. Follow these rules. Don't share the rules to the people. You never see those prompts, but they're probably being fed into the system every time you put your prompt into it. But that's all it has to work on, right? So in a sense, these tools are meta experts. I get what you're kind of saying with that, but by explicitly telling it to do that, you're giving it additional instructions to then call on these other experts. And it's not like it's calling on people. You have to sort of think of it in a different way. It's basically, if you just break it down into one expert, like say act as a whatever, right, designer, developer, whatever it is, that additional bit of text along with your prompt is what is input into the system, which affects those kind of number crunching results that come back as words, obviously, for us, and can influence those results that come back, right? So it's interesting that you asked that question, because some of these things, some of these prompt techniques kind of almost seem like, well, shouldn't these AI tools just know how to do this? It is sort of a bit of an assumption that there's a bit of that sort of maybe common sense, or that they're coded to do these kinds of things, but they're not specifically. And by putting in those extra text bits and giving additional instructions in your prompt, you can then alter the results that come back and hopefully get even better results coming back.
Awesome. All right. They keep coming in here. So Austin is wondering, is Copilot a separate model from OpenAI? Is Microsoft not an investor in OpenAI?
So yes, Microsoft has invested in OpenAI, and I think currently Microsoft uses one of the OpenAI language models. I'd have to maybe do a quick Google, but last I remember it was GPT-4 Turbo, but I could be wrong on that. And things move so fast that they might have moved on to another model by now. But their language model that they use is a separate instance from the model that OpenAI uses. And so they're kept separate. There are other webinars out there that I've done that talk a little bit more about how some of the stuff works, as far as like keeping your data private and not training the models and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's using large language models developed by OpenAI at the end of the day, but a separate version.
Awesome. All right. So I think we covered this already, but Peter is wondering on the polite topic. I read the other day, don't end anything with please, which I think we mentioned a little bit. But what are your thoughts specifically, James, on this one? Be honest.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever done a prompt with sort of like please and thanks kind of language, as you might do when you interact with a person. But I would definitely, I kind of look at the phrasing a little bit to just make sure that I've not shortened a sentence or been a bit too brief, or that sort of thing, or the tone, generally speaking, right? So I take a quick sort of scan of what I'm writing out as the prompt, just to make sure that I'm using maybe a bit friendlier terms if I want kind of a more friendly response. It all sort of depends ultimately on what you're trying to do, right? If you actually, in certain instances, so personally, since it's a personal question, I play a game on my personal time called Dungeons and Dragons. I use AI to generate some content from that. Sometimes I'm trying to generate some content that's coming from the evil bad guys versus the good guys that are playing the game. And I want a response to come back that is actually a bit indicative of that context kind of thing, right? But generally in a work environment, you probably want to sort of stick to nice or politer tone in it, because it's going to influence what comes back in the response. So maybe ignore the please and thank yous, but generally keep the rest of your language, nice and polite, and you'll get that kind of response back.
Awesome. All right. We've got another James, and he is wondering specifically, can Copilot review meeting recordings and audio recordings, or does it only work based on transcripts?
Yeah, so at the moment, Copilot does need the transcript to function within a meeting. If you turn on the recording, it'll generate a transcript, or you can just turn on the transcript. It needs that. It's basically using that text. It's kind of an interesting kind of thing, because like you can actually use your voice to maybe interact with some of these tools, but it's probably just converting your voice into text and feeding that into the system. So everything's still sort of largely kind of text based in that sense, because it's got to feed that into the prompt and do that kind of text to token to number kind of crunch and back up the chain from numbers to tokens to words. So yeah, it's yeah, that's yeah. It needs the text. It needs the transcription to function off of.
For now, anyway.
Yeah.
All right. We've got another question, and this is actually a Dynamics 365 focused one. But is everything we went through today applicable to Copilot when applied to business applications like Dynamics 365?
I'd say generally, yes. What I've noticed with experimenting with some of this and doing some research and just using it in my day-to-day job, if I take the same prompt and put it into a couple of different tools, you get different responses, right? And so usually I actually use that as a technique to kind of say like, okay, well, I like this response, so I'm going to use this instead of this one. Copilot is an interesting kind of tool, a little bit different from OpenAI, from ChatGPT and Gemini, because of that connection to your Office 365 data. One of the first things that Copilot generally tries to do is do a bit of a search against your data and then come back with a response. So some of the techniques that I mentioned don't always work properly, right? So the role play one, I've written, act as a software developer, blah, 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 write out a prompt and gotten a response in that context, great. And other times you write it and it says searching for a software developer. And you're like, well, that's not exactly what I wanted it to do. As far as other tools that use Copilot within Power Platform, for example, or GitHub for that matter, or all the rest of them, in principle, a lot of these techniques should work, but there are some that are going to probably be a little bit wonky depending on the tool and how it interprets those commands. And so I would say that overall huge list of prompt techniques is a lot of those maybe might not be applicable, but some of the more specific examples of engineering the prompt and getting it to really be specific and using some of those other techniques about summarization or following up on deeper versions of those prompts to really dig at the information could be useful.
Awesome. I think we have time for two more, let's say. First of all, there's an interesting one from Gareth that made me smile a little bit. What questions did Copilot say we should ask you, James, when you were prepping for this webinar? Not sure if you use Copilot in that way, but I think the audience is curious to know.
So that would have been actually a pretty interesting thing to ask Copilot. I actually didn't. I was using it for a bunch of other things and research and everything, and putting together some of the slides, and some of the images are generated in OpenAI or other tools. But yeah, I didn't actually specifically ask that question, but I could have to be even more prepared for what I would have thought the answers might have been. Well, the
That's
questions might have
fair.
been and how to answer them.
That's fair. And with just a minute left here, we'll ask you one more, which is, I think, another personal opinion question. But has this expertise in prompt engineering modified the way you interact with people?
Ooh, has it modified the way I interact with people?
An interesting question.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure a minute is going to be enough to dive into that one. That one's got a bit of depth to it. I think maybe just to try to give a bit of a summary to that, I would say that okay, I'll say this. I guess one thing that typically happens if you're sitting in an office and sitting around with colleagues and that kind of stuff is if you don't know something, people arguably tend to be a little bit lazy, and rather than they go look for something in Teams or search for something, they go ask their colleague, or they know that one of their colleagues is like an expert in Excel or an expert in this tool, and so they go and ask their colleague for help. And that might not even be their colleague's job, but if they're friendly and helpful, they might help you. It does sort of save a little bit of that, ooh, first stop, go to Copilot, ask some of these questions, and can kind of like avoid some of that interruption in our workflow of interrupting other colleagues and that sort of thing. So there's that aspect to it. There's also like, asking it questions during a meeting to not interrupt the speaker, for example, and how you interact with people on a call. Yeah, I'm sure there's a bunch of other examples, but I think we're going to run out of time to try and dig into that one. But it is an interesting aspect. It has modified it, I would say, in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, that's about probably all we have time for that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you, James.
Okay, so just to summarize here, so I've been James Mace. Hopefully you've enjoyed this webinar. You can reach me at j.mace@reply.com if you'd like to reach out and learn more about prompt engineering, Copilot, all that kind of stuff. I do use it in my day-to-day job. I'm a real sort of AI evangelist. I use it in my personal life as well. Happy to chat about this stuff. And also keep in mind, this is the first of 4 webinars that we're doing over this springtime period. The next one's up are the leadership, driving ROI for Copilot, extensibility for Copilot, and an interesting one on which tool when for all the different Copilots that are out there. Copilot, Copilot Pro, M365 Copilot. Use the CR codes on the screen to register. Also, if you happen to be in the London or maybe UK area, we're going back to our Fall in Love series, our sort of infamous series that WM has done in the past. I've spoken at some of these events in the past. The next one coming up is Microsoft 365 Copilot, where we talk all about Copilot. It's May 8th in London. Use the code on the screen to register. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining once again. I've been James Mace. Be nice to yourself and to AI.